Hello, web programming students. Welcome to part 3 of CSS. So we're going to talk about the box model, which I've mentioned before, but in depth, here we go. Our content has a certain width and height, but let's talk about width for now. And our content also has padding. So this is the space in between the content and the border, even if the border is 0. And then there's space outside of the border that's called margin. That goes here. And so our content has a certain width, whether it's a div or a paragraph. Our padding has a certain width, even if it's 0. Same for our border and our margin. So we'll be working with borders and padding and margin to move things around and give ourselves space as we develop our pages. So to give ourselves space and borders and padding and margin, think trouble. So when one value is listed for, say, margin, then it goes to all 4 sides. But if there's just 2 listed, then the first one goes to the top and bottom, and the second value goes to the right and left. So here, margin 0 and 10 be 0 for the top and the bottom, and 10 for the right and left. So if we're looking at our box model, then it's 0 for the top and 0 for the bottom, and 10 on either side. When there's 3 values listed, the first one is applied to the top, the second one goes to the right and left, and then the third one goes to the bottom. So here is the top, here's the right and left, and here is the bottom. And then if there's 4 values listed, then these are all 4 directions: top, right, bottom, and left. And you can think about it going in clockwise direction. So all of these are actually in clockwise direction, but if there's 4, then you can really count them: top, right, bottom, left. And this goes for borders, paddings, and margins. Borders, we can set all at once with how wide the border should be, what kind of border it should have, and what color the border should be. And we can also specify by the side. So we can do border top and make it different than the bottom, left, and right. So you can either write them all out like this or combine them into one like this. And then our default border style is none. So we can say we want a certain, sometimes it's solid. We've used dotted before. And so there's all sorts of different kinds of border styles you can use. So that's borders. Now we have something in CSS called box sizing. This can help us determine how big our boxes are. So we can determine how to measure the width or the height of our box. So if we have a width of 200 pixels, padding of 10 pixels, and border of 10 pixels, and we use box sizing border box, then the entire 200 pixels would include the content, the padding, and the border. So everything gets smushed into 200 pixels if we use border box. But if we use content box, then that same measurements means that we have 200, we don't get smushed into 200, and so we have to count each of the border, padding, content, and then border on this side, or content on this, padding on this side, and border on this side. So the total is 240, and this is how the default works. So without having to do anything, this is how you can measure your boxes, by the amount of border and padding that you have on either side, say if you're doing the width. So now that we've talked about pixels for a bit, let's talk about moving away from pixels, except for certain situations. So we want the most flexibility for our users. So locking them down into specific pixel dimensions for our boxes could result in uneven designs. It may look kind of funny or messed up on different screen sizes if you stick to pixels. So the remedy is to pick percentages or proportional units like ems or rems. So you'll see me doing percentages for widths of divs mostly going forward. But we can use ems and rems also. An em is based on the font size of the parent element. So by default, 1 em is 16 pixels. And so 1.5 em is 24 pixels, unless you change the size of the font the font size of the parent. You start a new font size, then your M's will be based on that. One rem, which is short for root M, is relative to the root or the HTML tag. So we can set an HTML tag what one rem is, and then the numbers will follow that proportionally. And just to point out, those of you who are graphic designers know this already, but an M in print is the width of the capital M of the particular typeface that you're using. But on the web, M is the height of the font. Now let's talk about CSS display. This requires us to talk about how elements are block or inline block. So the first one is block elements. These are elements that always start on a new line. So a few common ones are headings, paragraphs, unordered lists, ordered lists, list items itself, and divs. So they always start on a new line. There's not, they don't go side by side unless you make them go by side. And so they always start on a new line. Inline elements always appear to continue on the same line as their neighbors. So a few of them are A's for anchor links, images, M's, which is not to be confused with the M's we just talked about. This is short for emphasis, so like italicized text. Strong, which is short for use for bold text, and then spans. We haven't talked about spans, I don't think, so let's just talk about spans for a minute. A span, we can single out content for special styling. So if I just want to change the color of this one word, I can put a span tag around it in my HTML, and then I can style that span selector in my CSS. So I want to add a magenta color to it, then I can do span, and then that's my selector, and then the property is color, and then the value is magenta. There's a key difference between inline and block elements. One is that widths and heights you can have on block elements, but not on inline elements. And so if you add padding and margin to a block element, then you can apply it to all sides. But if you apply a width and height to an inline element, you can only fix the left and right sides. And so you can change whether an element is an inline or block by using the display property. So if you can take a block element and pull it and call it, add a display inline, then you can flip it. And so it becomes more of an inline element. To make a block level element an inline element, we add display inline, and then elements will sit next to each other, but we can't set a height or width. And we also can't set a margin and padding on the top or bottom. So that's a drawback. To make a block element act like an inline element while allowing us to set a height, width, padding, and margin, then we can do display inline block. So this is a special kind of inline in which elements will sit next to each other, but then we can set a width and a height. We can also set a margin and padding on the top or bottom. So inline block is really handy for giving some block features to an inline element. So we'll be using inline block going forward more often. To make an inline element on a block level element disappear, then you can just put the display none on it and then it won't show up. So now let's talk about CSS positioning. With static positioning, this is the default. Elements display in the order that they're written in the markup. So without any CSS applied to this HTML, we write these divs in order 1, 2, 3. They'll show up 1, 2, 3. With relative positioning, position relative like this, it moves an element relative to where it would have been in the normal flow. So the normal flow looks like this, 1, 2, 3. But if we make this position relative and then add some directions to it and some distances, then we can move these like so. And so this example, it's position relative, so it comes out of the normal flow. So instead of it being here, it gets shifted over some. The three box here stays where it is. And we have a top 20 pixels and a left 30 pixels. Now, you may think top, then it would go up, and left, it would go left. But Think of it one way, like from the top 20 pixels and from the left 30 pixels. So it sort of goes in the other direction. Or you can think of it as adding space in between where it would have been and where you want it to go. And so this 30 pixels is now on the left side of this 2 box, and the top 20 pixels is on the top side of this 2 box. So that's how you move it using relative positioning. Absolute positioning, the element's taken out of the normal flow, and it no longer affects the position of other elements in the page. So they act like it's not there. So this 3 moves up into where 2 would have been, as if 2 was not there anymore. And the same top 20 pixels and 30 pixels applies. But once you put something like this 2 becomes absolute positioning, then you calculate this 20 pixels and 30 pixels from the very top left corner of this 2, of where your browser window is. And so it's no longer 20 pixels top and 30 pixels left of the original spot, but from 0, 0, the top left corner. So we'll go through some examples in the demo, but this is how absolute positioning works. It takes it out of the flow. The 3 doesn't even act like it's there, and this 2 gets repositioned to the top left corner, and then you can do your top and left movements. Fixed positioning is sort of like absolute positioning, and it's positioned in relation to the browser window, and when the user scrolls, it stays in the same place. So if I did position fixed and then bottom 0 and right 30 pixels, it goes down to the bottom right corner. There's 0 pixels on the bottom, and it moves over from the right to the left 30 pixels, or in other words, here's a space of 30 pixels to the right of this 2 box, and then that's your fixed positioning. So if I were to scroll this, that 2 would stay right there. It wouldn't move around with the page as you scroll down. It stays in place. With our relative and absolute and fixed positioning, we can overlap items. And so we can choose how they overlap by assigning a Z index to them. And so we think of X direction and Y direction. The Z direction is now in and out and in and out. And so the Z, the higher the number is, the closer that element is to the front. So in this example, here is a Z index of 2 for number 2 box, and a Z index of 10 for this number 1 box. So the number 1 box, 10 is bigger than 2, and so 1 will be in front of the 2, like so. So you can make like a pancake stack of things using relative and absolute and fixed positioning and your Z indexes. So Z indexes can be infinitely long and infinitely long the other direction, and gives you a lot of flexibility for stacking things using relative and absolute and fixed positioning. So we could use absolute and relative positioning to make things go side by side, or we can use inline block things to make side by side, but there's one last way to make things side by side, and that's using floats. So when an element is floated, the elements move around it in a certain way. So if I had number 1, 2, and 3 floated left, then they can line up 1, 2, 3, starting from here, 1, 2, 3, float left, look like this. Float right, now 1 is starting at the most right, and then 2 is floated right, and then 3 is going this way. So this is first in line, and so the rest of them stack up from the right direction. However, it's all well and good until you want to stop the floating. Then you have to do something called clearing the float. But there's no easy way to do it, even though there's such a thing as a CSS clear property. It doesn't work the way we think it should. So we have to resort to other methods. The other method is clear fix hack. Now, generally, we don't want to use hacks. We want to write clean, nice code. But here's one time where we want to use this hack. And all the web developers, the very experienced ones, say this is good to go. And so we're going to use the clear fix hack. And I'll show this to you in the demo. But we'll add this CSS to this containing div that has the things we want to float and the things we want to clear after it. So we put a div around 1, 2, 3, and then we add this hack here, and then now we don't get our text floating up to the top here to fill in to the left, because this is floated left here, this stuff. So instead of getting this all here, we add a clear to this entire section here, and then our text starts on a new line after this, not up here. So we'll show you this to you in the demo, but that's floating and clearing. So now let's visualize some change. So just to remind you, pseudo classes, this is how we get hover action. So a hover over here, if we mouse over something, it changes color. We can control how that looks with some CSS, other than just changing the color of it. Now we can introduce timing and other ways to modify our divs and our CSS. We can do things like transform. So we can start with a certain kind of div, maybe a rectangle or a square, and then we can make it bigger, we can rotate it around, we can skew it. So we can apply the transform property to an element. So we can rotate it, we can scale it, we can move it, we can skew it, we can do all kinds of things. These are the things we can do. We can translate it, which means move it around, up, down, left, right. We can scale. So in the X and Y directions, height and width, we can rotate with an angle, and then we can skew the X angle or the Y angle using transform skew in our CSS. We can also introduce transitions. So a gradual change in one state to the next state. It allows you to change properties smoothly from one value to another over a given duration. So I'll show you this in our demo as well. That's a transition property. We can put a delay on it. So we can put a second or two to start after we mouse over, say, our link or something. We can set how long it's going to take for it to do the transition. And then we can specify which property this is going to transition. And then we can do something called transition timing function, which specifies the speed of how it changes. And I have some links here. These are also available in the Canvas module. So let's go into our demo. So here is an example I'm going to show you of the floating and clearing. You don't have to submit this at all. This is just me showing you how this works. Our demo will have this also in it, so you'll get a chance to practice this. But if we start out with a red, blue, and green box with 1, 2, 3, and some text underneath it, we can start to float them so that these boxes will go 1, 2, 3 in a line, and our text will be underneath it. So we can go into Atom, and I'll send you this code so you can see this. Here's our HTML. We've got one div, got two divs, and we got three divs. So I have in here, and something I need to show you is this has a class of 1. The second one is a class of 2. And the third one is a class of 3, but they also each have a class of box in the same part where the quotes are. Now you can do this to apply a class to multiple classes to a div. And so instead of putting them in one line like this, they need to be separated by a space. And so this way you can apply multiple classes to multiple divs and the same class to multiple divs. So this is different than this one, but this is the same as this one. And so this is how you can really get specific with your divs. And so we have a bunch of text here just to show you how to float text and divs together. And so here is our CSS to go with this. Again, here's our CSS reset. So reset all the margins and paddings and borders back to 0. And then our boxes are each 200 pixels wide and 200 pixels in height, and the text color is white. And then the class 1 is a red background color, and 2 is blue, and 3 is green. And then here you have our boxes. And so I want to add float left to them. And so now I want the boxes will, the one box will float to the left. So if I refresh this, go back to my browser, 3, 2, 1, refresh. Now they all smush up next to the 1. So all of these are floated left. They move as far left as they can, including this text. So this text moves up because this guy is floated left and everything else underneath it will float left. But I don't want this. I want the text to come underneath here. So I need to clear this float. So this is where we use that clear fix hack that I talked about in the slides. So got to run back into here in our HTML. And what we need to do is surround these divs with a bigger div. So I will do that here. And we get to give it a class name. So we can call it whatever we like. You can call it clear fix or group or clear, but I'll just call it clear fix. And then don't forget the closing tag down here. And so we have now encased these 1, 2, 3 divs in a bigger div that we've given a class called clearfix to. And so in our CSS, I have written it already, and so I will undo it. So we have clearfix, and then this is a pseudo class because it has the colon and the no space, and then after. And then here's the hack part, content of double quotes, clear both and display table. So once we save this, now 3, 2, 1, refresh, and now our text goes underneath this third box. We've cleared the float and it starts over on the next available line. That's how we do clearing and floating. Now, fortunately, if you progress further in web development and web programming, you will have this, you have it written for you in a framework. And so most of the time this work will be done for you, but in case you have to do it yourself, that's how you do it. So here's our real demo. This is the final product. This is what you'll make eventually. We have drop-down menus, transitions of the color here of the links, drop-down menus. So these drop-down menus are nested lists. And we've got the floating boxes again. And this one has a special mouse over and it transitions and it does a transform as well. So we'll do that in our demo. But right now, our starting point is this. It's a bit of a mess, but we will get it to look clean like this. So let's go into our Atom. So I've given you all the HTML. I just want to show you what these pieces look like. So our navigation is built from an unordered list, which has list items in it. And inside some of those list items, you saw those drop downs, are nested more links. So this link under Stark will have more links underneath it. So right now they don't look like much here. So Ned, Catelyn, and Arya will be nested underneath the Stark house, and then same for the Targaryen, and same for the Lannisters and the Baratheons. So we'll build this into this. So right now, our HTML looks like this, and we'll start to build some CSS to go with it to make it look like the final product. So we're going to add some CSS to this pre-written HTML to go from this to this. And we'll add the HTML to go for, we'll add the HTML for these boxes as well. But first, let's do our nested lists and other stuff. So go into Atom. Just to show you what we have, has an unordered list, and an unordered list has a few list items in it, one being the logo, a link for news, a link for the other drop down. So we have 4 houses, Game of Thrones, and then each of those houses will have a drop down in it. And I'll explain what the other classes that go along with this are. And then we have a bunch of text underneath here. And one thing to show you before we get started on the rest of it is this list item here, which goes for the other list items. Instead of a link like index.html, I have something called #news or #news. So what is this all about? So this enables you to click on a link in the menu in the navigation and go down into the rest of the page to get to that particular content. So here I have it written list item a href, and in the quotes I have just a hashtag or # and the word news in lowercase, but I don't have .html or anything like that. That's because this is going to link down to a separate section further down the page. And so I have here the word news, this is the actual thing I click on, and then our closing A tags, of course, and the closing list item. But further down the page here, I have an ID, and the ID is news, which is the same spelling, also lowercase, as the guy I have here. So that matches this, the one down here, except that the one up here in the link has this # in it. And so using that #, I'll click on it and I'll move down to where the news section is. So I'll show you where that is here. Click on news and it goes down to the news page. So that's the way to make internal links. So I've already put the classes in here for you, and now I'll show you what happens when we apply styles to these classes. So each of these ones with the drop downs have a class drop down, and then it has an A link, this anchor link, which I'll have the house name in it. It's got a class of drop button, and so I'll show you what that code does. And then the nested list inside of it has another class called drop down content, which styles it differently, because in our example here, this set of links has a white background or a light background, and this set of links has a dark background, and so we have to style them a little differently. So let's go back to our CSS. Right now we've got a CSS reset right here. So our margins, padding, and borders are 0. And you can see that in our starting point, everything's all smooshed up to the left edge. There's no padding or anything or margins. We'll make that line up nicely like here. So we'll use divs to make that come off the edge. And then we will style this up, because right now, not much going on here. So the next thing we can do, I have the background color already put in, and the font family, I already put that in for you, so you don't have to add that's from Google Drive or Google Fonts. So the next thing we can do is first, I want to get this text off the edge here. This amount of text all the way from edge to edge is hard to read, because your eye will have to go all the way from the left to the right to get to it, all of the text. So we want to shorten that distance a little bit. So what we can do is, I already have it in here. So we'll add a container to this just to get this text lined up a little bit better. And then we'll put our our floating boxes in there. So at the beginning of the text, I will do a div. This class will be called container. And then the bottom or the end of this is down here. Here. So that's my container div. This contains all of our text. And so in my CSS, I can start by typing the name of the container preceded by a dot or period, and then we can start to line up that text nicely. So next thing, we'll add a width to this, and we don't want to use pixels so much for these kinds of things because depending on the screen that you have and the browser that you have, it'll show up differently. And so instead, I want to use percentages. So let's say it's 75%. And then we can add margins to this, but for now, I'll show you what this looks like to begin. So we've got a 75% width on this container, which has all the text, and our text 3, 2, 1 refresh. Now, it's not quite as wide as it was before, but it's still pushed off to the left here, and I want to have it in the center. So the way to center this text, now we want to center the actual container div, not the text. We don't want it to be center aligned, like we just want to move over the div. So we want to make the div look from this to this. So in the center of my browser. This is not in the center of my browser. So how to do that? Do margin. Now, we haven't seen this yet. We've done pixels, but if we do margin 0 auto, that will have no margins on the top and bottom, remember, and then auto margins on the left and right. So we have two values here, even though there's not pixels, no margin on the top and bottom, and automatically margined on left and right. And so our end result is 3, 2, 1 refresh. Now it's in the center. This looks a little bit better, and we're in better shape as far as the text goes. So next we can do is start to build those floating boxes. So the floating boxes will go here, make a div class, let's say class of 1. And then I'm going to just have some heading ones here for each of the numbers, and then closing tag, whoops. So what I've done is I've made a div with the class of 1, put the actual 1 for a heading, and then close my div. And so I need 2 more of those. And so I'm just going to copy and paste these and change them accordingly. So this one's going to be 2, this one's going to be 3, this one's going to be the word 2, this one's going to be the word 3. Whoops. And so now I have 3 divs before my text, and they're all marked 1, 2, 3. Right now, we won't see anything but the 1, 2, 3 in our example, in our demo. So 3, 2, 1 refresh. Now I at least have these headings here, which will be turned into this. So to do something with them, we can go to our CSS. In our CSS here, 1, this background color, red, 2, that background color is blue. Oops. And 3, remember, these all begin with a period or a dot because they're glasses. This background color is green. And so I'll save this. If we go back to our browser, it does this. Now we didn't assign any widths or heights to this. And so all it knows to do is to take up all the space that it takes up here within the 75% width. And that's what we have for our background color. But our actual example looks like this. And so how do we do that? Well, we could add a height and width to these. So we could just add a height, 200 pixels, and a width. But that means we'd have to copy and paste these into each of these, which we could do. That's not that many things to do. Or we can do something more sophisticated and add another class to these guys. And so we can add multiple classes. So we could do it like this, class again equal, and they're different, they're boxes, so I'll call them box. We could do that, but that's not the most efficient way to do this. The most efficient way to do this is to keep them all in the same set of quotes and just separate them by a space. So if I add box to these guys like this, then we still have individual stylings for the color, but we can apply the same style, this box style, to all three of them. And so you can really get specific with divs, with the colors they have, but have some traits or characteristics in common. So if I go back to my CSS and make a box, class, then here I can put the width 200 pixels and the height 200 pixels, and then I don't have to keep them in the same place up here. So if I save this and go back to my browser, back to my here, it goes from here, 3, 2, 1, refresh, and now I got 3 of my squares. So that's good. Of course, mine has white text, so I can quickly change that in my CSS. When I go to box, I can specify color white. 3, 2, 1, refresh. Now I have white text in my 3 boxes. That's good. But my finished product has them all in a line like this. So now we need to float them. And so we need to float these so they're 1, 2, 3, and then our text underneath it. So what do? Go back to our CSS. How do we float this? Well, we're here in box, so we can float from here. Now we could float each of them individually through here, but we'd have to type it in 3 times, or we just type it in once in the box class. So if I save this, go back to my browser, 3, 2, 1, refresh. Now they're floated properly, but we have the text lined up here right to the edge of the third box. And there may be instances where you want that, maybe for images and captions and stuff like that. But our example, our finished product looks like this. So we want to do that too. And so we need to do the clearing thing where we clear this float, and then these guys go back down to underneath the 3 boxes. So how do we do that? In our HTML, again, we need to put a div around the things we want to float, and then use that clear fix hack thing to clear the float. So I'm going to make a div that goes around these 3 things. That goes here. I want this class to be, whoops, clear fix, because we're going to use a clear fix. You can call it whatever you like, but you have to make sure that it is cited properly in your CSS. So I want to close this div. And just to give myself a little note, because there's a lot of closing tags there, I'll make myself a comment note here. And depending on how you want to work, I can indent these so I can see them better by highlighting and hitting the tab key. And so these are nested nicely so I can tell which one's which. So again, the 1, 2, and 3 boxes will get a div, the clear fix div around them. And then we can go to our CSS and clear this float. So I'm going to type this down here to give myself a little room. And the way to do this, dot clear fix, because that's what we picked as a name. After, because that's the way to write the hack. And then content, a set of double quotes, whoops, then semicolon, the clear property, both. Now you would think just clear both by itself would work, but it doesn't. And then we need display table, which we haven't talked about before, but we'll talk about later on the semester about how you can make tables, but just called display table. And then if we save this, jump back into our browser, 3, 2, 1, refresh. Now that float has been cleared and we start fresh down underneath the boxes. So while we're working with these floated boxes and such, we can start to introduce some transformations and transitions using these boxes. And we'll also use them in the main menu, but our final product has this cool transition and transform. So I'll demo them at the same time. So as you can see, if I mouse over the green box, it rotates slightly and it changes the color of the number in there. And it does it not immediately, but over a little bit. So it doesn't do it very particularly fast, but it eases into it. Doesn't take very long, but it moves slow at first and then finishes off smoothly. So how do we do that? Back to R. We need to establish the hover state. So the one that hovers is the 3 box. So we can start a new one with hover in it. And then the first thing we can do right away is change the color. So when we hover over the 3 box, the color of the number changes. So let's just make sure that works. Down in here. Three, 2, 1, refresh. And now if I mouse over it, it changes color properly. Notice how it changes color right away. In our final, it changes color slower. Changes right away. Other one slower. So now we need to rotate that green box when we mouse over it. So back into here, we're at class 3 hover. Now we can add a transform. Now there's multiple ways to style a transformation, but I'm going to use a shorthand. So rotate. And you can rotate the X direction and the Y direction or the Z direction or in 3D, but I'm just going to use rotate like this. And then inside the parentheses, I'll just put 10 DEG for degrees. And then that's my transformation. So when I mouse over the green box, it'll rotate, it'll transform by 10 degrees. 3, 2, 1, refresh. And now you can see I mouse over it and it rotates right away. Again, the example, the final product, slow, nice transition. So let's add this transition. The transition is here, goes in the same place. Now you can see when I was typing this out, you can specify the different properties. So transition delay, I don't have a delay on this. So if I were to mouse over it and have a delay, then whatever the delay was, it wouldn't start to make the transition thing until after that delay was over. I can specify the duration and the timing function, but I'm going to do a shorthand and put them all in the same line. So I want it to take half a second to change. So you can either write it as 0.5 seconds or 500 milliseconds. It's the same thing. So let's keep it half a second. And I want it to ease in. So slow at first and then finish up. You can add a delay into this, but I'm not going to have a delay. So I'll just end it there. And then if I save this and go back to my browser, 3, 2, 1, refresh. Now we got the nice transition. So that's pretty cool. And so now we have that done. We can build our navigation finally. This is our navigation. This is what we got. Now let's put some things together. So in our HTML, let's go back here. We got some classes here. We got a class logo for the logo. We got a class of drop down. We have a class of drop button, BTN. And we have a class of drop down dash content. So each of these pieces of the navigation has drop down, drop button, and drop down content. So those classes will get applied to each of them. And so we need to add those classes into it. So in our CSS, we can start to add some more style to this. But before we do that, we can clean up some things with our unordered list. Which we can't see because of the margins. But if you could see the margins, there are bullet points still attached to these. So we have to get rid of those. List style type. The answer is none. Although we have all sorts of options. We want none. We want a margin of 0 still for that, and padding of 0 for that. And we want to hide our overflow. We haven't talked about overflow hidden yet, but we want that. And our background color is 333. So right now, 3, 2, 1, refresh. Let's see what that does for us. So now that gives us our background color that we want. So that's good. Our text still looks funky here. We'll change that still. And they're also still vertically stacked. We want them to be lined up. So how do we do that? We can do a few things. But the best thing to do is just float them left. These list items in particular. Go back, 3, 2, 1, refresh. Now they are lined up here. And we don't need to clear them, actually. This is a special case. So don't have to worry about that. You get off scot-free here. Or float-free, as the case may be. So the next thing you need to do is style up the individual links. So our individual links have this class of drop button. And so in our CSS, give ourselves a little more room again. We could just put drop btn, but we want to make sure we're really specific. And so we can add this to the beginning of it. So in our list items, in our A anchor links, inside our list items, we want to get this particular class. So that's very specific. And then we can display inline block because we want to add a little more padding and stuff to them. Inline block. We will see display used for other things next week, but for now, inline block is the way to go. Color white and text align center. And text decoration none, of course. We don't want the underline anymore. And our font size, we're going to boost it up a little bit, 1.5 ems. And finally, we want to add a little padding around each of them because right now, if we go back, they're kind of squished together. So we can add padding. And remember, if we have two values, then it's the first one is the top and bottom, and the second one is right and left. So I'll say we don't want a full m's worth, maybe just 0.8 m's, and then 1 m padding on the left and right. So if I save this and go back to my browser, 3, 2, 1, refresh. Ooh. Nothing happened yet. Oh, I missed something. I missed this. Should have a comma there. Now it should work. 3, 2, 1, refresh. Now it works. So what happens is, I was mistaken earlier. I misspoke. Both the LIs and A's and the drop buttons, not just the drop buttons within L and I and A's. So these two and this will get all of this style. The way it was before, it was just the links, just the A parts were getting this style. So we actually need this comma there. So my bad. Now we got this. This is a little better. We still have to line them up a little bit. This logo is way too big. We'll shrink that down in a second. But first, let's build the list part of this. So next, we need to get the hover action going a little bit. So LI, A again, hover, because we want the hover action. We also want action on the drop down. So we can just add the hover to the class name also. And we need the drop button, whoops, the drop button to also have styling to it. Color red, so we want things to turn red when we hover over them. And let's just throw a transition on there too. So that red color will come in, same thing, 5 seconds and ease in. So if I save this, come back to here, 3, 2, 1, refresh. And now at least the lower or the sub ones will transform or transition, sorry, from white to red over 5 seconds and slower in the beginning. So I still have to build the submenu part of it, but now we have at least this part transitioning fine. Next are list items that have drop downs. We want them to display inline block. So these are list items that have a class of dropdown, which are these. So the top level stuff, the names of the houses, they will, whoops, they will now line up properly. So save this, 3, 2, 1, refresh. We need to do more. So let's do more. Not quite finished. We haven't talked about drop-down content. These are the individual ones. Whoops. These are the ones that have the subparts. So when we are looking at our page, we don't see these right away until we mouse over them. So what we can do is add a display none to these so that they don't show up until we do something with them. So we can put display none. Then what else can we do? We can actually start to use this position absolute and relative thing going. So if we do position absolute, it also takes them out of the flow. And so you don't see them, they don't take up that space anymore that they take up now. So we'll get them out of there. They also have their own background color, remember from the example. So this one is F9, F9, F9. We want the Z index to be 1. We don't want them hide behind or anything, or hide anywhere. And so there are two other things that we hadn't talked about yet, but are useful for this case here. Min width 160 pixels. Now, I talked about not using pixels anymore, but this is a good way to at least ensure that your device is at least 160 pixels wide. And as you can see these drop downs on a device. So here's a case where pixels is okay. And then one other thing I hadn't talked about was box shadow. So we can make a drop shadow to help visibility and such. You can specify the direction of the box shadow or the sides of it. And so again, we can use pixels. This is okay. You might want to use ems if you like, but I'm going to stick with pixels right here. So similar to top, bottom, right, left, the shadow, 0 at the top, 8 on the right, 16 on the bottom, and then 0 on the left. And I will add an RGB color for a little bit of transparency. So 0, 0, 0, and then my alpha channel, my transparency will go 0.2. So that'll give us a dropdown that hides normally. It's positioned to absolute, and you can now put a Z index on it and a background color, of course, and a drop shadow, also known as box shadow. 3, 2, 1, refresh. Now they're gone. We have to add the hover part still, but once we add the hover part, then you can see them again. So we're going to add that. Drop down, hover. Wait, that's not it. Oh, sorry. Drop down content A. So what this is that any A's within a drop down content will get this style. Black text, a little bit of padding. We'll do pixels again. but you can add your own units. Text decoration, none. We don't want any underlines anymore. Display block and text align left, because those were left aligned in the final. Let's see if this changed anything yet. 3, 2, 1, refresh. We don't have any hover yet, so you'll see that style that we put in once we get the hover going. More room. Drop down. Content A, hover, so that we just worked on. Background color. This one is, whoops, F1, F1, F1. So let's see if that gives us our drop downs. 3, 2, 1, refresh. Not yet. Almost there. Almost there. Drop down, hover, space. It's very important. Drop down content. This one, display block. Three, two, one, refresh. Now we finally have our drop downs. Whoops. All right. You can see that the house names are center aligned, but the sub items are left aligned. So we add that. So now we can do something about this guy here. It's too big. Back to our CSS. I like to write them in the order I find them. And so that one is somewhere in here. If you remember, this has a class of logo, and that's what we will use. So dot logo. And here we can give it a width. My width is 100 pixels. Give it a height, height auto. So using height auto, it is default, but using height auto means that it doesn't get bent proportionally. So if we shrink it down to 100 pixels, then the height will adjust accordingly. And then we're floating this left. Whoops. We're floating this left. And we're adding a little bit of padding on the right side, and then a margin left on the left side. 3, 2, 1, refresh. Now we have our logo properly sized. It comes back to the home page. And somehow I have red text for that. What did I miss? So I found where I had messed up and had these text for the houses of the Starks and the Targaryens and such. Red, I missed a comma somewhere. The comma should have been here. So I added this comma. Now 3, 2, 1, refresh. Oh, that didn't work. What happened? I found my mistake, and that should not have this comma here. So that's a lesson, teachable moment. Sometimes a comma really matters, so accuracy is very important. So this should be not separated by a comma, but these are associated. And so now 3, 2, 1, refresh color for our navigation items. And so this is an opportunity to use developer tools to debug our code. And so we can do this if we're in Chrome. You can right click on things and click inspect. That'll bring up a panel here on the right, or depending on how you're set up, it could be at the bottom or the left. But you can see what style is being applied when. So I have, let's select Starks, or no, actually go to the navigation itself. You can drop down. Here's the Starks. And so if I click on this line here, then I can see what specific style is being applied to this. So, and I can turn them off and on to see what happens. So if I turn off the color white, you'll see that the links go back to blue and purple, depending on if you clicked on them or not. You click off and on this check mark for display inline block, and then you'll see now there's a little bit more padding because now that it has the block characteristics to it with inline block. Click off and on text decoration, you'll see the underline come back. Font size, change font size. Padding, we added padding. So without the padding, it looks like this. Now it looks better. So that's the way we can use Inspector. Now Safari is a similar process. You may need to enable it in your settings, but Chrome, you can right click or command click and get to it. The other way you can use this is to select an element in the page to select it, to inspect it. So if you click on this icon in the top left corner, then you can mouse over and pick different things you want to look at. If I want to look at this one, then give me the code here, and here's the styling that's being applied at the moment. And here's a way to check your box model. So this is all under styles here. There's different things you can use to check different things. So computed is another way to show what styles are being shown at the moment. But styles is the one you'll see most. If you don't see this right away, there's usually something with like a message from the developers. You can click out of it and then you'll get to this part here. And then another thing is nice is that you can click toggle device toolbar and you can see how responsive your page is. And this will be more important in a few weeks when we get to responsive design. But at the moment, you can plug in different devices and see what it looks like. So on an iPad, this is what it looks like. On a Surface Duo, this is what it looks like. And so it's a nice way to see how your code is looking. So one more, you can click off of this, come back to this, and then close this. One more thing we need to do. Our example, our final product has extra space in between each things. And so we can add some space in between here by going back to our code, and somewhere in here, we can add code for the H1s, H2s, and the paragraphs. Again, these are block items, block level items. So H1, we want to style them all at the same time, H2 and P. So if we want to style them all the same, we can separate them with commas. And then I'll add what I wanted to do here, margin top, 2 M's. So now with 2 M's, we'll give ourselves a little more room so that these can breathe a little better. 3, 2, 1, refresh. And now we are all done. This moves properly. This transitions properly. These drop downs pop up properly. We can click on these to go down to the proper section. You may see, and we didn't do it here, back to top kind of links. We can go back to the top by using reverse, having a ID somewhere at the top here to click back to. So here's our finished product.